Well, good evening, everybody. Mayor Judy, thank you for hosting us tonight. And I got to tell you guys, for those of you who are not from this area, not from Stone Harbor, this is probably the most fun mayor I've ever met in my entire life. I mean, she has gone parasailing with me, hundreds of feet into the air. And I'm over here doing Facebook Live, and she looks like she wants to crawl up into a ball and just sleep for the rest of the day. It was funny. It was last summer. But, I can't say enough nice things about Stone Harbor. They have some of the nicest people. Their local government is very, very receptive to ideas that we want to do. And when I approached them several months ago about hosting this, they were all open arms. So thank you, and thank you to the borough of Stone Harbor. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Nick Pittman. I've been in this area for quite a while. I started my career when I was 17 years old for NBC 40 News. I'm sure a lot of you remember NBC 40. So I've been at this for quite a while, but not nearly as long as some of my counterparts on this panel. I think together we have a combined 200 years of experience, so that's pretty cool. And I got to tell you something else, all right? I mean, weather guys just ramble on and on, in case you haven't noticed. Out of all of us here, we can't possibly be wrong. So there's a 100% chance that we're right with whatever forecast is out there. So I want to welcome, I'm going to have everybody else introduce themselves. You'll hear from me throughout the night. I'm going to present the first topic, and basically everybody has been assigned different topics, different aspects of hurricane season, tropical development, impacts and whatnot. So everybody has their own presentation, and then at the end we will do a QA session, and we're going to go on, all right? So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll get started with this first guy to my left.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name's Joe Martucci. I'm the meteorologist for the Press of Atlantic City. I've been a meteorologist for about 5 years, so I had small contribution to the combined 400. But I've been here, I'm relatively new to the Press of Atlantic City. I started here last September, but it really feels like home to me being here for 10 months. I've tried to get everywhere across South Jersey throughout the past short time that I've been here. But as far as weather, a little background on myself. Before I was here, I worked in private weather consulting, working with OEMs, DPWs, sports teams, trying to figure out when they could plan their activities, or in the case of an Eagles game, which was a client, whether or not they can get the game in for lightning, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm very keen to having awareness in terms of your events and how much the weather counts. It's not just so much it's a 60% chance of rain. It's okay, when is the wettest part of the day? When is the driest part of the day? When is rain going to change to snow? All those kind of things, that really gets me really interested in weather and kind of drives me here. So I appreciate you inviting me, Nick, and thank you.
You're welcome. Mr. James Eberwine.
Thank you very much, Nick. Ms. Mayor, thank you very much for inviting us. 50 years in meteorology. I began in 1968 in the Marine Corps. Spent 4 years in the United States Marine Corps. Joined the Weather Service in 1972. And I retired from the National Weather Service in Mount Holly, New Jersey. I worked 35 years or so with emergency management throughout South Jersey. I've been to the beaches here many, many times. Actually walked the beach from Sandy Hook all the way down to Cape May, videotaping the beaches, see where all the hot spots are. I teach a course in aviation weather hazards at Atlantic Cape Community College, and also teach freshman ACIT meteorology. And my students are fixed wing helicopter pilots, drone pilots, and air traffic controllers. And Nick, thank you very much. And I'm very happy to be with my fellow weather guys from up north. So welcome.
Thank you. And before I introduce Mr. Lemaine, let me tell you something. I watched him growing up, all right? And he was a huge inspiration. Huge, all right? So here I am, 5, 6, 7 years old, and watching this guy on TV, I wanted to be just like him. I won the CBS 3 Kidcaster competition back in the early 2000s, and I met him, and he was like 20 feet tall to me back then.
Was I 12?
Yes.
About 13 years old back then?
Yes, exactly. So, Mr. Tom Lemaine.
Thank you, Nick. And thank you, Mayor Judy, for allowing me into Stone Harbor, some places I am not allowed in. But I have a resume to prove that. I was able to get away in broadcasting for 50 years. And Nick asked me to deal with hurricanes that impacted my life, or at least I had something to do with. And I said, well, you know, how about having hurricanes that did not impact me as opposed to those that did? My birthday is September 14, which I think is right smack dab in the middle of hurricane season. So you can imagine how many of my birthday parties were really screwed up by hurricanes. Since I was in broadcasting 50 years, do the math, you can imagine that I was around for the great storm of 1944. I wasn't very big at that time. I was a little younger than Nick was when he first watched me do something. But so I will deal with hurricanes, storms that did impact me, and I had a direct relationship with, and most of the storms, I can remember what happened, even when I was this small. Because when you're having a birthday party, and by the way, it was during the war, and of course, back then, any of the boys who were in my party happened to be the oldest males in the neighborhood because all the men were off at war. So that was a big responsibility you had to have when you were 5 years old. And so I do remember that. Anything that impacts the birthday party of yours when you're a little kid, of all the things you might or might not remember when you're of that age, that's the one I do remember, in addition to the others that I'll talk about. Thank you, Nick.
And to my right, I'm going to introduce somebody who has actually become a very good friend of mine over the past couple of years. This is Justin Godnick from News 12. He was actually one of my backups, a main backup for me for a good year for SNJ Today. And I was sad to see him go, but he's now full-time with News 12, and it's long overdue because he's one of the best I know. So take it away.
Oh, thank you, Nick. Thank you, Mayor, for having us. Really appreciate it. You know, living through Sandy like a lot of us did, I live a mile in from the beach in Monmouth County. We got hammered just as badly as you guys did down here. It was just an incredible storm. It really put things in perspective that New Jersey is not invincible to these hurricanes. We're not immune to them, and to be prepared is very, very important. I got into the television industry about 8 years ago, graduated from Rutgers with a degree in meteorology. I love it. You know, when I was 3 years old, I used to be standing outside in snowstorms. My mom would yell at me to come inside, but I just enjoy the weather so much. And, you know, New Jersey's changing. We have more folks living at the coastline than ever before. A lot of people come down here for vacation. So being prepared for these storms, understanding the dynamics of them, is just so important for all of us here. And hopefully tonight we'll get some information to you, and you can ask some great questions about how these hurricanes are going to affect us in the future.
Thank you, Justin. We have Mike Favetta, correct? And Mike, I just met about 6 months ago. Genius. He's over in Europe now studying the climate, so it's a great addition to this panel. Mike?
Thank you very much. Thanks so much for having us today. My infatuation with weather probably started in kindergarten. I got this video cassette from my uncle for Christmas called Danger's Edge. It was this 30-minute documentary from the Weather Channel, and it came with those big old floppy disks that go on a Commodore 64, and you could plot hurricanes. And this was, you know, back in 1988, so I thought I was, you know, king of the Northeast. I'm plotting hurricanes, you know, reading the maps and watching the animation go up, and that's really when it hit home that I wanted to do meteorology. So I finished school up at Kean University with my meteorology undergraduate degree at a really important time, especially in broadcast meteorology, because camera phones were all the rage. You know, there were no touch screens. A few really important people had BlackBerries, but you got your weather from TV or the newspaper. You know, there was no social media. There wasn't an iPhone yet. And over my 10-year career in broadcast television, I've got to witness from paper maps, from, you know, forecasting with printouts from a laser printer, all the way up to these fancy 3D graphics that we see, this augmented reality in HD on TV today. And that's when the conversation changed from people seeing me in the street and going, hey, Mike, what's the weather this weekend? What's the weather on the 7-day? To, is climate change real? So you kind of had this shift in a short amount of time from people getting their weather information from an app or from the palm of their hand, anytime, accessible 24/7, to focusing more of their attention on what's going on with climate change. And so that's what took me to Europe. I collaborate with a company in Milano called Centro Epson Meteo. They're like the AccuWeather of Italy, and they work with my company in northern New Jersey, Weather Prep, to help companies reduce their risk of a changing climate.
Thank you, Mike. We're looking forward to hearing your presentation. And last but certainly not least, a relatively new friend of mine. This is Steve Sosna, NBC 10. We first connected on Facebook back when he came to NBC 10. He's from Philadelphia, but just recently came back, and I'm happy to have you here, buddy.
Good to be here. Nick, I have your back on this one. I was watching Tom LeMaine in diapers as well as a child. We love you, Tom. Actually, it's funny. Tom was my inspiration.
Next thing you're going to say, I babysit for you, right?
I'm not going to go that far. It's early on in the game. You know, I watched Tom on TV. I used to read Jim Eberwine's discussions from the National Weather Service. I collaborated with these three guys here in the last few months and years, and I graduated with this guy. So the business is small, so don't burn your bridges. You will run into these people again. You know, like other people on our panel here, my love of weather came very early, about 4 or 5 years old. There was a lightning bolt that landed right next to our car when we were coming home from a vacation in Florida, and from that moment on, I was infected. So much to the point where I had weather alarms going off, and my parents wanted to kill me because they would go off in the middle of the night. They had to actually disable them. And I took that passion and I brought it to high school and I brought it to college. And, you know, in 2008, I was left with the choice of where do I go from here? And it was in the midst of a recession. And, you know, I had a news director in Minnesota say, come on out here, don't you know? And that's where I landed. I landed in the middle of Minnesota, and wow, you know, you challenge yourself by going into this job, because as much as weather can be unpredictable, so can this career field. And so, you know, I made the leap. I went out to Minnesota. I saw EF4 tornadoes. I was in 40-degree below zero weather, dust storms, fires, yet people still live there. I was very curious of why they do that. And then from there, I went on to WNBC in New York. I worked there for almost 6 years combined. I filled in on MSNBC during Hurricanes Harvey and Irma. You know, at one point I did 17 hours straight of coverage. That was definitely a challenge, being that I had a wedding in 4 weeks after that. My fiance was ready to kill me too. So like I said, you know, this business poses a lot of challenges, but it's also very rewarding. And having all of you weather enthusiasts here is super important, because we love interacting with you, and you're part of the process. It's not just us delivering that information to you, it's you delivering information to us in that two-way street. So thank you all for being here today, and it's an honor.
Can you do that Midwestern accent again?
Oh, yeah. I had to get rid of
don't
it
know
before
what that
coming back home.
A couple more acknowledgments I have to make. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Alan Nosov, who is one of my interns who actually put this presentation together. He couldn't be with us today. He's on vacation. And we are one short on the panel. That would be Mike Masco from Fox 29. I got a message early this morning that he had a family emergency, so our thoughts and prayers are definitely with him in that situation. So a couple other people I want to point out in the room. We have one of my little proteges over there. This is John the Weather Kid in the SNJ Today shirt. And yeah, that's all right, stand up. We all know him. And in the back, we have Alex Bronsky, who is also one of my meteorology interns this semester. And the reason I'm pointing these people out, because they're going to be here in 5 to 10 years from now. And they're very intelligent people. I have come across a lot of, I don't want to call kids, but you know, young people that, I mean, I guess I'm young, I have an old soul, that love this field, and they have a passion for it. And you know, it's rewarding to be involved in their lives in any way I can, and I'm sure these gentlemen can speak the same. We find people, or they find us, and we gravitate towards one another because it's we have something in common. So welcome John the Weather Kid and Alex and Alan, who is watching our live stream from Myrtle Beach. Thank you for doing all this. All right, so let's get right into the nitty-gritty. I am going to be covering my hurricane forecast, which doesn't differ too much from what the National Hurricane Center's put out. That's my weather dog, Sky. Sky is a very good dog, and she's a little bit of a handful sometimes. So first thing that we're going to talk about, the most likely storm tracks, okay, specifically for this season. And when you're forecasting hurricanes, there are a veritable plethora of factors that you have to look at, all right? And we're going to explain the different factors throughout the evening here. But when you look at anomalies, when you look at historical patterns, when the atmosphere was doing X, Y, and Z during a certain time frame, we can basically extrapolate into the future what we think is going to happen. And this is the map that I came up with this season. We have the lower Gulf of Mexico, and then if you remember, a few weeks ago, we had Chris, right? Now, Chris, I believe, is going to be an indication of things to come this season, all right? I'm more concerned about tropical development a little bit closer to the continental United States than I was last year, all right? So a track right up the East Coast, you know, I'm not saying that that's absolutely going to happen and we are going to be impacted by a tropical storm or a hurricane, but judging from what we are looking at, there are conditions that are favorable for such a thing to take effect. One of the things that we have to look at is a broad area high pressure, Bermuda High, and that acts as a steering current, okay? So if you get a tropical system to develop and basically take the track of where that arrow is, that high pressure can essentially just drive it up the coast and then towards our region. So we all remember it was 6 years ago, high pressure had a big influence in driving Hurricane Sandy towards our beaches, all right? Sandy was one of those storms. The damage, the images will forever live in our memories, you know, very vividly. The amount of devastation seen by, you know, a weak Category 1 hurricane, a strong tropical storm, there's that gray line there, by the time it made landfall. Just imagine what a Category 2, 3, 4 could do. And, you know, I'm never one to scare anybody. That's the one thing I never want to do. But it's not a question of if, is it going to happen? Is it if? It's when. Eventually, there is going to be a major hurricane that impacts our region. It's something that cannot be denied. It's something, you know, with more people living along the coastline than ever before, more expensive property, more real estate. There is going to be future devastating events, and they are going to hit here in South Jersey. I don't know if that's 5, 10, 15 years from now, if it's this year. But judging by, you know, where things are going in the world, there is going to be a huge impact at some point. So we have to look at sea surface temperature anomalies. And basically, what I have highlighted there in blue, that is cooler than average water, and then in red, obviously, that's warmer than average water. The MDR stands for the main development region. Now, this time of the year, we look for the African wave train. Okay, that's when you get these disturbances that come off the west coast of Africa, and we're able to watch them for 1, 2 weeks, that they slowly move across and then develop as they get into a more stable environment in an area that's more conducive for the development of tropical cyclones, and you can fuel those thunderstorms and whatnot. You need, for a good, healthy system, warm water. All right, now, the one thing that's really different this year opposed to last year, we don't have a whole lot of warm water in the area that, you know, most of these things form in. So this is why the forecast has changed a little bit. See where all the warm water is? Right off the coast of the Carolinas, east of there. So that is why, if we go back to my map, that is where I think that most of your development is going to be and where most of the storms are going to track. We saw Chris become stationary. It didn't really do much for several days, and then once it intensified, it was like a rocket ship. It just went and went and went. So I think we're going to start to see a little bit more of that as we go into the next month or so, all right? So development a little bit closer to the continental United States. So just a few notes here. I'm expecting slightly above average. We're not going to be looking at least in my opinion, the gentleman on the panel might disagree, but we're not going to see historic hurricanes like we did last year, certainly not the record numbers that we saw either. It's a trickier forecast because, look, when these storms develop closer to the U.S., we don't get to track them that long, all right? You might have 4, 5, 6 days, whereas if they're coming off the west coast of Africa, they intensify and you can track them for well over a week in many cases, and they're moving slowly. That's not going to be the case when something pops up off the coast, and it basically it's a matter of how long is it going to take to intensify? Is it going to rapidly intensify? What are the driving mechanisms behind it? All right, so those are all things that we certainly have to take into consideration. We're looking at the neutral ENSO, and I believe Justin's going to explain more about this, or somebody is at least. The ENSO is the El Nino Southern Oscillation, okay? It's one of those oscillations that our weather is dictated by basically atmospheric conveyor belts, all right? So you have areas of high pressure and low pressure all over the world, and they work in tandem to bring certain weather patterns our way. When El Nino occurs, that's warmer water in the equatorial Pacific, that makes more of a turbulent environment for tropical development because you get a lot of wind shear, and basically you get the thunderstorms that try to bubble up, and then you have the tops of them sheared away. So storms that develop don't really have an opportunity to grow and intensify, all right? So El Nino is good for the lack of tropical, or to inhibit tropical development. When you get into neutral, it's kind of up in the air. It's anybody's game. And then when you have La Nina coming on, you don't have much in terms of trade winds, and you don't have much in terms of shear, and the environment is a little bit more favorable for tropical development. So that's where we're going with that. And that's my piece on this season. We have the peak of it coming. It's right around my birthday and Tom's birthday. We're 2 days apart, by the way. I'm the 16th, you're the 14th. So
2 days older than me.
yeah, exactly. So
Now we finally found out.
yeah, there you go. You're 25. Wonderful. So the peak is coming. Historically, we will watch the tropical activity ramp up as we go into August and early September. I've had my birthday rained out many times over the past due to that. So I'm going 11 to 14 named storms, 5 to 8 hurricanes. Looking at the data recently, I'm probably going to lean on the lower end there, actually, and major category 3 or more, 1 to 3. Compared that to last year, we had 6 major hurricanes, and some of them were record-breaking with the winds, and it was just an insane season. I don't want to get into Steve's stuff, but you see the average right there in the middle, so not too far away from average. That's my official forecast. Now I will pass it over to Mr. Steve Sosna.
All right, so to say the least, 2017 was kind of a wake-up call. We had been going through kind of a sleeper period, with the exception of Sandy, of, very quiet weather in the tropics. There wasn't any major or blockbuster storm that had made landfall for about 12 years. So if you think about it, out of sight, out of mind, people tend to, put their guard down. And that's kind of one of the challenges that we experience as meteorologists is this year-to-year variability. You just never know when you're going to get that busy year, and hopefully your audience isn't caught off guard. So as you can see all the names checked off, and we can actually check off Rena. Rena developed very late in the season as well. So we had a number of storms. And as we go on into the next presentation here, you'll be able to see what we have, because simply, we had a number of named storms, and in total, we had 23 landfalls that happened last year with all the storms. So there you go. There's the 7th most active season since 1851. So again, it was very jarring, and you can see my PowerPoint's out of control. There we go. 17 named storms, 10 hurricanes, and 6 major hurricanes. Now, it was a very busy season, but you also can't fall into a sense of complacement even when seasons are not very active. You have to remember, go back to 1992, South Florida, Hurricane Andrew. That was the A storm. It only takes one really powerful storm and, a period of a week of, the pattern being more favorable for a strong hurricane. So that's what we saw in that week in August. So it only takes, a small amount of time for a storm to form and potentially become a catastrophic hurricane. Now that is a look at, I believe, Hurricane Maria, I'm sorry. Maria was the storm that, just devastated Puerto Rico as a Category 4 hurricane. And that storm was really, I think, the strongest hurricane to hit Puerto Rico since 1932. So something that we go into as meteorologists is sometimes a blind spot. For instance, when Sandy came in, I was forecasting weather in New York City at the time, that storm came in at a trajectory that we've never seen before. So telling people what's going to happen in Newark, New Jersey, and Jersey City, we had nothing historically to go off of. So trying to communicate to our audience, to you and to the rest of the people out there was a little bit challenging. They're asking, emergency managers are asking, what's going to happen in my town? And we have to say, you just have to prepare for the worst case scenario. And I think in some regards, it did turn out that way, especially in northern New Jersey, Staten Island, and Queens, where we had to initially fight the mayor of New York City for a little while. On Saturday night, he basically wrote off the storm and said that it would be very bad upstate. And my news director, after I just told her this would be one of the worst storms in history, she goes, you got to explain why he's downplaying this. And so when you're explaining to your boss in the most populated city in the country why you're going different than the mayor of New York was a little bit challenging. But by the next morning when I came into work and you look at the spaghetti plots, right? And it usually looks like a plate of cooked spaghetti all over the place. And it was a solid stack into the central New Jersey coastline. At that point, confidence was high. And, I said to Chris Cimino, our morning meteorologist at the time, we got to have people evacuate Zone A. And so that's what we did. And so Tom Yamas, who was an anchor at the Today Show, said, are you calling for an evacuation of the city and the mayor's not calling for it? And yeah. So he went on the Today Show and talked about that. But in retrospect, you have to kind of go with what your gut is saying. And my gut was screaming, we need people to get out of there. And unfortunately, we lost a lot of people in Staten Island and in the Rockaways, and there was a huge fire. So sometimes you have to challenge even people that you're with and with other decisions, but I'm a big believer in going with your gut feeling and collaborating with other great minds like these guys on board here, and sometimes going against the grain, which isn't an easy thing. So Hurricane Irma was really just a catastrophic storm, but could have been so much worse. We had the three real big storms last year, Harvey, Irma, and Maria. They were kind of the trifecta. And what saved South Florida was this slight jog of Irma along the northern Cuba coastline. We had a lot of damage in the United States, I think over $200 billion worth of damage. You could easily have put that at $300 billion if that storm wouldn't have interacted. It was a wobble of 10 miles. Think about it. On a global scale, 10 miles is nothing. 10 miles, it wobbled into the northern coastline of Cuba, which has a ton of mountains, and kind of weakened it a little bit. Otherwise, it would have been Category 5 storm. So for Maria, we had the lowest pressure on record for the Eastern Caribbean. Winds 70 miles per hour. It increased 70 miles per hour in 18 hours. And this is one of the things that we had last year was this rapid intensification. You're looking at a tropical storm with 40 or 45 mile per hour winds when you're going to bed, and then you wake up and all of a sudden the thing is a Category 2 hurricane. And those are the types of storms that, we fully don't understand yet, but we're getting there. So last year we have this brand new satellite in space, your tax dollars paid for it. It's called GO-16, collecting data every 1 minute in space. Prior to that, it was every 5, 15 minutes. And so we're getting better data. We're flying unmanned drones 60,000 feet in the atmosphere now. So your hurricane forecasts are going to get better and better. And actually last year they were actually spot on. You always hear when we're wrong, but you don't always hear when we're right either. And those hurricane forecasts were very accurate, not only for the Leeward Islands, but for South Florida and for Texas. All that rainfall in Houston was well predicted. So those meteorologists, especially those local meteorologists, help save lives. As you can see, some of the costliest hurricanes there. Back in 2017, we had $208 billion worth of damage. Now, you have to go back to 2005. The previous record was Katrina. You know, Katrina did a ton of damage, but unfortunately, what happened in the Houston metro area, what happened down in Miami with a lot of the flooding, we surpassed that number. And the three combined ended up being the costliest natural weather disaster in the United States. So it surpassed all our previous weather events. So, you know, we had all that damage, but miraculously, our messaging is getting better. What we're communicating to you about storm surge on social media, on the radio, on TV, you're being immersed in it. And that information you're taking away and you're digesting it. And with all those, terrible hurricanes that we had no storm surge deaths in the United States, which is pretty remarkable and a significant improvement in how people are understanding what to do in hurricanes. And I think, I don't think the number of storms is going to go down, but I think the number of lives we save will go up because we are just flooding. There's no disconnect now. There's, between the 6 and 11 News, you have Twitter, Facebook, you have Facebook Lives. The information, you guys are hungry. You want more and more and more. And because of modern technology, we're able to deliver it, which is super good. And so, that was the challenge. It was a very, very busy year. You can thank the lighter wind shear out there and the warmer sea surface temperatures. That in combination with each other really led to a terrible season. But you have to watch out for this season as well. As Nick was saying, you can get a storm that forms over the Gulf Stream and can juice up very quickly. So hopefully we won't have another 2017 again, but if we do, hopefully we have the reduced number of deaths as well.
All right, thank you. And now, Justin, you are up to the plate.
All right, cool. One of the things I remember distinctly, as Steve was saying, was the news directors kind of freaking out during Hurricane Sandy. I went into work, and one of my bosses came up to me and said, I can't believe what I'm seeing. I'm seeing 10, 15-foot storm surge. That's when the water lifts ahead of a hurricane and gets pushed inland. I just can't believe that some of these models are actually representing this. And that really caught my attention, and I knew, that was the moment I knew that this was going to be that bad. As Steve was saying, I had this moment myself where it just clicked. When it comes to tropical cyclones, this is a large rotating low-pressure system. It always contains the stronger winds and certainly heavy flooding rains, two characteristics that go along with it. There are hurricanes in the northern Atlantic and the east-north Pacific basins. But it's funny because people always say to me, what's a cyclone, what's a typhoon, what's the difference? Well, it's all the same type of system, just different names, of course, in different parts of the world. A typhoon is in the western North Pacific basin, and then you have a cyclone in the Indian Ocean and the Indian Basin. Cyclone development stages. So tropical disturbance, now called an invest. This is somewhat new. For a long time, we just called them kind of tropical waves. Now we look at them as invest. It's an undefined area with a broad circulation. So this is no different than a big area of thunderstorm activity. A little bit of wind involved, certainly flooding rains, but not a lot of organization. So clusters of storms revolve around an open, low-level circulation. Winds here are not going to be really damaging yet with an invest. They're less than 39 miles an hour. Tropical depression, this is when things start to get a little interesting. And when you hear about tropical depression coming, the big concern will be flooding, particularly if the storm is moving slowly. And a lot of the smaller island countries throughout the Bahamas, throughout the Caribbean, are very subject to flooding from tropical depressions that are slow moving. So it's defined a closed low-level circulation. The clusters of storms revolve around the new closed low-level circulation, and winds still less than 39 miles an hour. But again, it's the flooding here that you're most concerned about. Tropical storm, this is where things start to get damaging from the winds as well. Convection of more storms begins to tighten and rotate around the center. You don't have the defined eye that is characteristic of a hurricane here, really, with the tropical storm yet, but you're getting close. Heavier rainfall, stronger winds. Your wind field, 39 to 73 miles per hour. So once you get into that 70 mile per hour plus zone, that gets quite damaging. Even above 60 miles an hour, it does get quite damaging. And there you go with a hurricane. So this has a strong central rotation. You'll notice the development of an eye wall here beginning to form. Feeder bands, those outer bands that go around a hurricane that often have tornadoes within in them, some of the heavier rain, thunderstorm activity. With a hurricane, your winds are 75 miles an hour or over, so that certainly will cause damage. As Nick was saying before, Sandy was not a blockbuster hurricane. This is a stronger Category 1 storm. I think Sandy's top winds were 90 miles an hour. We weren't really ready for this. Yes, it came in at an angle that is very different than other hurricanes come in. Basically, it was riding the eastern seaboard and hooked a sharp left right into New Jersey. It actually made landfall about 15 miles south of where I live on the Jersey shoreline. You know, the devastation was incredible along that northeastern quadrant, the northern quadrant of the eye wall. Some of the worst in damage. Of course, here there was a lot of damage, but up towards the Seaside Heights area, that image of the Jetstar roller coaster in the water, just incredible damage. Major hurricane, this is where we get into the types of storms we had last year, the Marias, the Irmas, the Harveys. These are storms that are extremely healthy and very well defined. And you better hope if a storm like this is heading in your direction, it's moving quickly, which Harvey, of course, did not. That storm sat and dumped, again, rainfall amounts that many of my colleagues, including myself, we would look at these amounts being projected and say, is this real? Can you have 40 inches of rain? Can you have 45 inches of rain? All the models were spitting this stuff out. A lot of us didn't believe it because it just seemed impossible, and it happened. These storms generally have winds greater than 111 miles per hour, so very damaging. The Andrews of the world, the Katrinas of the world, you think back to some of the bigger names, those were major hurricanes, and they certainly caused a lot of damage.
Justin, which of these storms this past season was your favorite to cover and why?
I would say Maria, and it's certainly hard to call it a favorite with all the damage it did and everything, but I would definitely say that in terms of just watching this happen, it was almost surreal. I got into work at 4 in the morning to do my morning shift at News 12, and I had the radar up, and I saw the storm approaching Puerto Rico. And it was so well defined, so strong, and I just said, dear God, these people are going to absolutely suffer from this. There is no avoiding this. There is no getting out of the way of this. This is going to hit Puerto Rico head on. And I just watched almost in slow motion as this came in, and then the radar got destroyed on Puerto Rico itself. So we lost the radar image as the storm was coming up and over the island, which I thought was, you know, it brought me back to Hurricane Andrew, which blew the radar off of the top of the National Weather Service in Miami. You know, when you lose a radar, that there's got to be some strong winds, that this is serious. So certainly, Nick, watching that in slow motion, it was almost like watching a slow motion train crash. It was happening. There was nothing you could do about it, and you just had to sit there and watch it occur.
Right. You know what? I apologize. I have to be careful with some of the words that I choose sometimes because there is a fine line. You know, saying words like favorite or excited. You know, we walk that fence every day because as weather geeks, this stuff does excite us. We just wish that there wasn't a loss of life or damage, of course. But it's really incredible seeing these monsters form in the ocean and just seeing it all come together. And it is actually, you know, fascinating and exciting to forecast. So if I ever slip, just, you know, hit my hand or something, all right? Mike Favetta is next from News 12, formerly News 12.
Yeah, sort of, formerly. I worked yesterday for this guy, so sort of the same thing. So yeah, I still have a little bit of presence on television, but like I mentioned before, now that I've left television full-time to work more on the research side of meteorology, you start to see some different patterns. You start to see, you know, the more of the in-depth side of the science, working with the people who literally design and program these satellites that Steve was talking about that are launched up into space and deliver this 1-minute imagery. And the guys that also program these really cool maps that we put together here. So when we forecast a hurricane, we are not, meteorologists on TV are the ones delivering the information. If you want to go to the next one, I think it's coming up. There is a this law as Nick put it, that we must follow. All of these fancy tracks and plots that you see with the cone of uncertainty, this big red swath where it's going, all of that comes from the National Hurricane Center, a team of brilliant PhD scientists with each dozens of years of atmospheric science experience. And they use their best knowledge to hand plot where a hurricane will go. So take it whether you watch Channel 3, whether you watch Channel 6, whether you watch Fox 29. Channel 10, whether you watch Channel 10. You're going to see the exact same red, yellow, blue, whatever color the station chooses, cone, and you're getting the same exact information. So that's important to note that no matter what weather website you want to go to, where you see all these fancy spaghetti plots like piles of pasta plotted out on the ocean, you're always going to see the same handcrafted map from an experienced team of meteorologists. And all of this is from a division of the, I think it's the Department of, which government? Oh, you would know. Commerce, thank you. NWS is right here. So it's all under the Department of Commerce. NOAA is a branch of that. And then the National Weather Service is a branch of, why am I talking about this? Jim is sitting right there. So the creation of the GOES 16 satellite was a huge step in forecasting, because here in America, we were the last large nation on Earth to put this advanced satellite into space. Europeans had the EUMETSAT, which has this really fancy 1-minute imagery at a high resolution called the Advanced Baseline Imager. And Japan also has their JMA, Japanese Meteorological Agency satellite, with this super fancy, high-tech camera, if you will, up in space. So when the United States got that up there, it was game on. And we had now full 360-degree coverage of the Earth, putting in the best information we can into our very fancy weather models. And over the course of time, the higher the resolution, the better the weather forecast. And it takes a lot of processing power and a lot of money, obviously, to get that forecast down from, in 1990, you see that large blue wide track error, what would you say, that's 300-400 miles or so, down to a much smaller area of uncertainty. So that's really good news. So we have a lot of resolution, we can see a lot more than before, and while this gives us more advanced warning, there's also a double-edged sword, because as we've seen in recent hurricane seasons, no matter how good the warning is 3 and 5 days out, those last-minute track jumps that bring the eye 50 or 100 miles north can completely change where the evacuation is and where the hardest part of the storm will hit. And there's a little bit of this, this new research that's ongoing called rapid intensification. At the very last few hours before the eye makes landfall, we see this big burst of energy, and that really makes for a much stronger hurricane, something that happened with Hurricane Harvey last season. So with all of these advances, a lot of the higher resolution modeling, I mean, look at the difference. The bottom left plot just looks like blobs of yellow and green. The top left corner is a little more high resolution, and then on the right, you have almost like this beautifully high resolution furry dot there that shows all of the detail. Well, all of that is not only computed on a horizontal scale in terms of space, it's also on a 3D scale. So there are these different vertical slices and levels that have to be taken. You have your y-axis, your x-axis, and your z-axis. So there's this incredible amount of computing power that has to go into creating a very good hurricane model, which then feeds the information to the Hurricane Center to give you the hurricane track that we give you on TV. There are some new types of watches and warnings and advisories that were proposed a few years ago, and Jim will touch more on this, that's his expertise, regarding the storm surges with their watches and warnings, because we all have heard that while hurricanes pack a lot of wind, the most dangerous and deadliest part of a hurricane is the storm surge, with that big inundation of seawater. And with the big advances in hurricane forecasts, there are also issues with communication. So as we've been referring to Hurricane Sandy since we all worked the storm, it's known that the storm changed its technical, scientific, physical properties after it made landfall and was technically, according to a textbook, no longer a hurricane. And so, you know, you still have the power of a hurricane, but it's not technically one. So as a scientist, what do? Well, the people that are living there that have their roof blown off don't care. They just want to know. So that's why this new hurricane force wind alert was created. And it was a new kind of advisory to still convey the information that even though the hurricane warning is over, it's still as strong as a hurricane and could still do some serious damage. So there's a lot of issues and a lot of work to be done in terms of the social aspect and the social communication of how people, not only English-speaking people like us, but people that speak other languages, people that aren't necessarily familiar with what hurricanes can do in the Northeast. Maybe they're a transplant from California and used to earthquake prep. They've never seen a hurricane before, nor do they know how to prepare for one. So it's kind of this interesting communication quandary of how you keep everybody safe. So with all of this types of observational data that feed into the weather model, we have the satellites. We also have these drop zones, which are like little packages, if you will, a weather station that's housed in a cylinder that is dropped from the Hurricane Hunter aircraft with a parachute. And it falls down from the Hurricane Hunter aircraft through the storm and takes that vertical profile every few feet. We'll take a measurement of temperature and wind and dew point, which is a fancy way of saying humidity. And all of that information is very important in terms of forecasting how and where, how fast the storm will strengthen and where it will go in the future. There's even some other cool technologies from NASA, which I would have loved to include in this. It's called the Global Hawk. And we all know what drones are, but this looks like a mini airplane, if you will. It's like a little bit smaller than a Cessna airplane. And it's an unmanned drone with wings and a tail, and it looks like it could, you know, hold people and be a commercial airliner. But it flies for, I think, 90 to 100 hours in this automated pattern, taking the upper air observations above a hurricane. And those are crucial in terms of forecasting where a storm will go. You can't send a hurricane hunting team with a team of, you know, 7 or 8 scientists up in a flight for 100 hours, so send a robot. And the robot just flies around in circles, and it was this machine developed by NASA delivering the best weather data possible in order for us to, as meteorologists, to forecast storms. And then there's also obviously a trust issue. We like to think, as myself, a former full-time TV meteorologist, and all the TV meteorologists up here, that our viewers develop a trust relationship with us, that, you know, the information we deliver is truthful and accurate, and you at home trust us. Well, that's great, and we do our best to maintain a high level and a high standard. But then we've noticed in the last few years, with the advent of social media, there are these new, sometimes referred to as armchair meteorologists, those that maybe aren't as experienced in the social science or the physical science, and kind of put an unfounded alert causing a little bit of panic to get that shock post and have a social post with shock value that may not be completely truthful. And so there's an issue of knowing who to trust, whereas if you read that there's going to be the worst winter on record, 2018, 2019, think of who it's coming from. And even so, it may not have, if it's the most official sounding source in the name, may not be as official as you think it is, because so you can kind of hide behind a curtain in social media. So that's it. We'll talk a little bit more about climate change. I'm sure there's some questions about that when we get to our Q&A session.
So I just want to say, you can really tell who a true professional is. That wasn't his topic. I actually made a mistake. He was supposed to be talking about something else. He didn't look at that once, so he just went with it. So great job. I do want to get your thoughts on climate change at the end of this, though, because there was a whole presentation, and I didn't get to put it in. Mr. Martucci's next.
All right. Thank you, Nick. So being down here in southeast New Jersey, what I'm going to do is talk about the impacts of flooding and wind here from hurricanes. I lived in northeast New Jersey. I've worked in northwest New Jersey. I haven't been to southwest New Jersey, but I've been to southeast New Jersey. And weather matters, from what I've gathered, the most to all of us residents and people who live down here. for multiple reasons. One, of course, we live down here, but second, we have tourism, which is huge for us, especially right now. Even on cloudy, rainy days, there are people at the shore who make money, and when we're talking about a hurricane, it is the flooding that matters the most. So what I'm going to do here is take the clicker. Let's see if I got it right. Oh, I know my clicker. I don't know if I know this. Oh, sorry. Hold on 1 second. Should I go back?
I'll assist. Hold on. Oh, wait, oh no.
Let's
Oh
see.
no, hold on. Wait.
We ruined everything. Sorry. I'll just talk for a second about hurricanes. So actually, hurricanes, when I was growing up, was something I loved doing. And my mom, dad, and grandma are here in the back row. And they would remember, they're waving, and they're actually on vacation right now in Seaside Park. So they decided to come on down. I asked them to come on down, so they did. But so when I was a kid, when I was 5, 6, 7 years old, I had one piece of paper that showed the United States, and it had like a little cut off at the end. It had some white space over there, and I attached another white piece of paper there, and I drew Africa, Europe, and Iceland, and I made my own hurricane forecasting map. So, and I did that for a long, long time, and that was, while the internet wasn't really the internet. Let's see if we can get it. Am I in the right one? All right, here we go. So, I am with the Press of Atlantic State. This is where you can follow me, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Real quick, what I do is I do forecast videos. I also write in the press every day on the Back of the World section. If you do get the press, you can see me there, plus on social media. So let's start off with the quadrants of the hurricane. There are 4 of them, of course, and we have the front right, which is really where you're getting the maximum impact of the storm. You can see the counterclockwise motion here of the hurricane, and when you're on that upper right part over there, you get not only the strongest part of the storm, but you also get the storm motion as well. So, for example, if you have a hurricane with 100-mile-an-hour winds, it's moving 20 miles an hour, you get 120 miles an hour winds. On the front left, you see significant storm surge. It also depends on the track, of course, and I'll get more into that. The bottom right, you still see significant winds kind of pulling back around those winds, so it moves with the storm. And then in addition to that, you have the bottom left. It's the weakest one, but I still wouldn't say it's a nice day if you're in the bottom left part of hurricane. That is still a dangerous part of the storm to be in here. What I want to talk about is flood insurance. That's, if you live on the Barrier Islands, you know all about this. New Jersey, when you consider both the inland and coastal locations, 231,956 policies. The state of New Jersey is not that big compared to, let's say, some of the other states down here, but we are densely populated. So we're the 5th highest in the country in terms of number of policies taken out, but we're only 47th in terms of area here. So we're the 47th biggest state when you tack on Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. as well. So we have a lot of people here, and people, if you don't live on the Barrier Islands, you probably know somebody who does, who has to be involved with this. So that's also why we're concerned about coastal flooding here. When we're talking about flooding, storm surge and winds, and I'll talk about winds too, make up over half of all the fatalities, is not the wind. The wind, I'm not going to say we can withstand. There's obviously very dangerous impacts to that, but storm surge impacts everybody because it gets on the roads, it gets on the, gets on the beaches, moves inland, and if we can't move out, then you're just kind of trapped, and then you can start seeing some other impacts from that. Let's talk about tidal flooding too, not related to a hurricane, but just regular coastal flooding. We see about 30 times a year on Absecon Island, Stone Harbor somewhere around that, and that has been increasing. If you go back to between 1950 to 1969, on average, we'd had 3 coastal flooding events per year. Now we're near to 30, so that is a big increase that we have. And when you tack on a hurricane, which brings storm surge, in addition to the winds, it makes these storms only more powerful. So there's 3 different ways that we can flood. We're talking about a hurricane, and I apologize. I actually had this animated. We just couldn't get it worked out, so that's quite all right. But let's start off first. You have a low-pressure system starting off in North Carolina. It just moves due south to north. That was like Irene in 2011. Yeah, we had some storm surge, but typically, in these 2 cases, Irene and Donna, they were fast movers. Of course, Donna was a very significant storm, but in terms of the coastal flooding, we've had worse, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Floyd was another one too, 2 to 3 foot storm surge. The second one is more of an inland motion, so it might be a storm that's not necessarily a hurricane or was a hurricane. It would be a remnant storm. Hannah and Doria come to mind here, but we were still in the strongest northeast quadrant of storms. So it may not be a hurricane, and we were talking about this before, but it still can be very impactful, especially in coastal flooding. It can actually clog the Delaware Bay because what's happening is you have counterclockwise motion around that low pressure system. Picture it somewhere in the Delmarva Peninsula. Well, what it's doing, it's not only pushing water into the Delaware Bay, but it's also cutting off water from flowing out of the Delaware Bay as it's moving through. So you really get really bad coastal flooding in Delaware Bay. Of course, we would get coastal flooding along the Atlantic Ocean and the back bays as well. Scenario 3, we'll just say it's moving from east to west. That was my mistake there. But Hurricane Sandy is really the one. We got double trouble. If parts of South Jersey, specifically Long Beach Island, were in that northeast quadrant, and also got the added impact of just how big Hurricane Sandy was. Now, for us here, we also saw a good amount of coastal flooding just because of how large the storm was. And we did set numerous surge records. However, it could have been worse if the storm actually made landfall, let's say, in Cape May, or just went up the Delaware Bay, because we would be in that northeast quadrant here in Stone Harbor. But of course, tremendous damage up and down the Jersey Shore, especially in Ocean County, especially Monmouth County, like Justin was talking about before. Here were the historical crests for a couple of areas up and down here in South Jersey. Sandy was the highest one for Ocean City, Stone Harbor, and Cape May. Atlantic City just shy, and Barnegat Light on the bay side wasn't, but it was for many of the places in Northern Ocean and Northern Monmouth County here, or excuse me, all of Monmouth County. Let's go back to the quadrants one more time. So we have the front left, the front right, and the bottom left, and that makes an impact for the winds here. So all the storms in recorded history within 100 miles of Stone Harbor. We've had 9 Category 1s, and that's been the most. 2 Category 5s, 1 Category 3. Thankfully, we have not seen a major hurricane, but that doesn't mean we can't. And on average, we see a hurricane, it's the return interval once every 20 years here in South Jersey. And that takes into account that technically Sandy was not a hurricane when it made landfall just around Brigantine here. So let's take a look at, this is Sandy, and I know the numbers are hard to read, but in short, the darker the colors, the stronger the winds were. This is about the track of Sandy where my red dots or my red lines were here. You can notice if you see that bright pink spot, 91 miles an hour in Seaside Heights. For us down here, the winds weren't all that bad because we didn't have the motion, or excuse me, because the low pressure system's moving counterclockwise. We're on the left-hand side for the most part. The winds are actually moving away from us in terms of the storm motion. So if you had 100-mile-an-hour winds, storm's moving 20 miles an hour on that track. It's really more like 80 miles an hour winds. Still, Cape May did actually get strong winds at 75 miles an hour, but you can see Cumberland, Western Atlantic, Northern Cape May County was sub-hurricane status. What the National Hurricane Center is doing now, and this is new for this year, all these winds here are in tropical storm force, and the National Hurricane Center is issuing maps, and I'm sure we will all use them at some point. These are pretty much time to stop preparing maps. When you start getting into tropical storm force winds, which is what the National Hurricane Center is starting to put this map out for, that's when you need to stop preparing and start acting. In addition to that, many OEMs, police departments, fire departments, they won't come out to respond to tropical storm force sustained winds because it's too dangerous for them to be out. So it's really imperative where if you are told to evacuate, even if it's a voluntary evacuation, you should evacuate, because if you're trapped with storm surge and there's 2 feet of water all around you and you can't drive and you're not going to walk your way out, you may not be able to get saved either, unfortunately. Some final notes here. Sea level rise, we talked about that, continues to cause more issues here. Jim might be talking about this in a little bit. It takes 45 hours to evacuate Cape May County completely. However, there is some good news on that front. We actually do this quite often, and Jim might touch upon that a little bit. Contraflow, which is opening up the roadways so you can go both, if you're in Atlantic City, you can take the Atlantic City Expressway, both on the westbound and eastbound lanes, taking it out onto the mainland. That's the only way to evacuate Atlantic County. If we were to get a hurricane during August or Labor Day weekend when hurricane season does peak, and we were to evacuate, not only everyone here who lives at the shore, but people who have second homes at the shore, or people who are visiting for the weekend or for the week. And it's always important to trust your source. We were talking about this before. I call them social mediaologists, people who are on social media spreading, doom and gloom. They're not always, a lot of these people, if you're seeing them, they might just be trying to build up hype to get followers and attention. But you want to trust your source. You want to make sure you have somebody who is good, somebody that will be there for you and will give accurate information. So with that, thank you very much, and thank you, Nick.
Thank you for your presentation. Joe and I have something in common here, and it's like a fraternity. Okay, we both came after Dan Skeldon, so
We did.
I understand. All right.
Yes.
Great presentation. Now we are on to Tom Lemaine. Take it away.
Does that look like a guy who's retired? Doesn't really, yeah, that's it. I'm going to nod off in a minute there if you. Contrary to what you may think and what I said about, all the hurricanes that impacted my birthdays, and I was born and raised in Atlantic City right on the beach. I have a new home there right where I was born and raised, and I'm on the beach again. So you would think that, at some point in my young life, I said, oh yeah, I want to be a weather guy. The first time I was interested in doing the weather is when Channel 3 offered me the job. Because I had done sports for 15 years. And there was one occasion during Hurricane David that they had sent the chief meteorologist at Channel 3, back then it was Joe Whitty, who was a forecaster, did his own forecasting. They sent him down to Miami to cover the hurricane. I had already done 6 p.m. sports, and the news director came in and said, we need you to do the 11 o'clock weather. And I said, how do I qualify for that? Well, you were a Navy pilot, you mustn't. But that was all military, and Joe did his own forecasting. We don't care. We need a weather presence on the 11 because Hurricane David is becoming a problem. So that was my first weathercast, and like I said, I didn't do weather until I was asked to do it. And then, as it turned out, I had filled in for Joe for a while, and back in later on, they said, we have to make a decision. Do you want to do sports or weather? And I said, well, what do you want me to do most? And they said, we want you to do weather. So I said, good, send me back to college. I want to work on my master's degree in atmospheric science, and Channel 3 will pay for it. And I said, terrific, you got a deal. So in 2 years and 1 semester, I had 45 credits in atmospheric science and earned my master's degree. And I said, if this doesn't work out at Channel 3, I can work for a movie company or a farmer or somebody else. And but it did work out, and I got away with it for a long time. The storm of 1944 was my first experience, as I mentioned earlier. We had no warning. The warning we got for that storm was when the water started to come in my front door. And I said, Mom, there's a lot of water in the living room now. And basically that was it, and the kids had to scramble to get home to where they were. And it was a devastating storm that came offshore Atlantic City, destroyed Steel Pier. We had a destroyer, Warrington, was sank, and 248 sailors were lost. Actually, 300 to 400 people died in that storm. 145-mile-an-hour winds were the top gusts. And for those of you who are, how many are barometer fans in here? Anybody have barometers at home? Okay, well, then you'll know that 27.55 was a pretty low reading, but it wasn't the lowest. Stay tuned. Hurricane Donna. Hurricane Donna. Guess what? 9/14. Is that my birthday? Yes, it is. Hurricane Donna tracked almost the same as Gloria, believe it or not. It was very similar to Gloria's track. And the interesting part about Donna was when it came east of Atlantic City, it became elliptical. Most of the images we've seen right now are storms are, perfectly circular. But this became elliptical to the point where the western wall, even though the storm was well out east of Atlantic City, when it became squashed and egg-shaped, the western wall of Donna came ashore Atlantic City. Now, I was working at a radio station. I was working my way through college, and I was doing record hops and things like that. I was having a good time. But because I lived on the beach all my life, and I was talking to fishermen, people who really got into the nuts and bolts of being affected by tropical storms and coastal storms, nor'easters, I always knew that there were two parts of a hurricane if you were in the eye of the storm. One was the winds were going to come from one direction, you're going to get a clear period, and then the winds are going to come from another direction. Well, when Donna was just east of Atlantic City, the winds had only come from one direction before the skies cleared. And I said, wait a minute, there's still a second part of this storm. And I warned anybody I could reach at that time saying, don't go out in the streets yet. The second half of the storm is going to hit within the next 15, 20 minutes, and it did. And that made Gloria very, very unusual. The Donna very unusual. And again, it made landfall in Naples, Florida, came off the coast of Daytona. And it was just an unusual storm. And once again, 27.46, you barometer fans out there. That was for Donna. Hurricane Gloria, as I mentioned, Gloria and Donna, if you look at the charts, they pretty similar in their tracks. Gloria was a storm in 1985 that was the first to affect New Jersey since Donna. And it was 145 miles off the coast of New Jersey. And actually, the eye of the storm was 50 miles east of New Jersey when it passed this close to Stone Harbor. I know for a fact that was it because I was inside the Hurricane Hunter at that time. Somebody mentioned one of the humans flying in. That was one of the humans that had a 13-hour flight into Hurricane Gloria. I was invited to go on board only as a worker. I had to take, you heard about drop sounds. One of my jobs was to drop sounds into the eye of the storm, measure the winds and everything, take radar readings. And the main thing was that when you're inside the eye of the Hurricane Hunter, and don't forget, this was back in 1985. Thank God we didn't have social media back then because the word coming out of the Hurricane Hunter was gospel. That's where all the information about a hurricane originates. It goes from the Hurricane Hunter into the National Hurricane Center in Miami, and then it is dispersed to the media. So when you're inside the eye of the hurricane, you're the one who's telling the rest of the world what's happening with that storm. I was able to, Neil Frank was the director of the National Hurricane Center back then, and he said, you earned your stripes here, you're working pretty hard, we're going to let you go on the air live from inside the hurricane on the Channel 3 newscast. And I believe that's the first time. I wasn't technically a member of the media because I was working. They didn't have a slot. When that hurricane was that close to the coastline, they really didn't have a slot for a media person, so I had to serve as a worker on board and take the readings. And therefore, Neil Frank trusted me in saying what I was going to say on the air because, again, whatever I was saying was gospel because I was inside the eye of the storm. They're usually 10-hour missions, and they're relieved by another aircraft that comes up. At the time we were north of, actually New England, it was determined that Gloria was going to come inland. Well, once any hurricane comes inland, the Hurricane Hunter is no longer needed because land observations take over. So since it was only about another 3 hours before the storm was going to go inland, instead of sending another aircraft up to relieve us, they extended our mission. So I was one of the humans aboard this bouncing around in Hurricane Gloria for 13 hours, and it ended. There was one, by the way, 27.14. Are you barometer fans still with me on that? That you'll find is the lowest of any of the storms I'm going to talk about, 27.14 on the barometer. What happened, and I was always embarrassed by this, Dan Rather was interviewing Neil Frank, who was the National Hurricane Center director at the time, and maybe this is one of the reasons Dan Rather's career ended abruptly, among other things. He said to Neil Frank, even though the hurricane did not come ashore, he said, boy, Neil, you guys really blew it, didn't you? Well, no, we didn't. I was in the hurricane when it was 50 miles east of my home. And in the northeast quadrant, I was explained by Joe and others, we were still clocking winds of 135 miles an hour. Now, all that hurricane had to do was take a left-hand turn slightly, not as sharply as Sandy did, but a slight left-hand turn being that close to the coastline, and we would have had some really bad damage and probably loss of life. So it really took exception to to the statement that Dan Rather made, and as part of the media, I was embarrassed for our profession. You have to really take information that comes from the official people, as Joe and Nick and others have mentioned, and just take those social media guys for what they're worth. Now, Hurricane Sandy, that was unique in that it took a left-hand turn. I mean, a sharp left-hand turn. In golf, it's a hard dogleg. And that doesn't happen with hurricanes. They usually get up to this latitude and they veer off to the northeast. Despite the fact that it took that sharp left-hand turn, Hurricane Sandy, and I guess you guys might agree, Hurricane Sandy was about the easiest hurricane to forecast where it was going to go. It had nowhere else to go but straight inland over New Jersey. And it passed directly over my house. I live in Atlantic City. And if you hear what the National Weather Service is saying, 2.5 miles after it was declared non-tropical, I had a real serious problem with that. I mean, if it's that close to the mainland and it's ready to make landfall, just keep it as a hurricane. I know it became extratropical and the cold air came into the core and it wasn't technically a tropical storm. But you emergency management guys, I don't think you give a hoot about that, do you? This is still a hurricane, and it's still got the same amount of power and damage that it's going to, and you need to know that. I think there was a false sense of security when, oh, it's no longer a hurricane. Oh, wow, am I relieved? Well, no, it was still as strong as it was, and I really had a problem. And I finally got, at the next hurricane, an emergency management meeting that was taking place in Atlantic City after Sandy, I got the guys who really are important, the most important people during a storm, emergency management personnel. Officer back there, I'm sure you're part of that detail, and I appreciate that. And I finally convinced the National Hurricane Center director, don't do that again. Don't do that. It's going to make landfall really, and they said it made landfall 7 o'clock, 7:30. No. I took the measurements when I was in Atlantic City. 27.76. Are you barometer fans still with me on that? That occurred shortly after 6 p.m. Now, I think maybe the National Weather Service wanted to fudge the time of arrival a little bit so they can say, well, we really gave you plenty of time. It was well offshore and didn't make landfall till 7:30. Wrong. It made landfall shortly after 6 o'clock. And I had a problem with that, and I hope this is something that will never happen again. It was pointed out that they're going to make changes in this. This really did a disservice to emergency management personnel for telling them it's no longer a hurricane. That's all you heard. People don't care if it's extratropical or cold air came into the core. They don't want to hear that. 115-mile-an-hour winds and 233 deaths. And, Atlantic City was spared simply, believe it or not, simply because the eye of the hurricane went right over Atlantic City. And as was mentioned, the northeast quadrant of the storm, where did it hit? Ocean, Monmouth County. Because the strongest, if you take a left-hand turn with the storm, the strongest part of the hurricane was directly impacting Ocean, Monmouth County, and up further north, not Atlantic City. So it affected 24 states with a monster. As a matter of fact, I think it was the largest storm ever. It had a 900-mile circumference. That's a pretty big storm. Caused 233 deaths. Hurricane Sandy. I don't want to hear Superstorm Sandy. It was a hurricane, historical flooding, 8.9 feet. I live in a house, my new home was built under what new regulations? In other words, the living quarters have to be 10 feet above mean low water. In other words, 10 feet above the highest tide ever recorded. Okay? Everything below 10 feet is not covered by my insurance, which was discussed earlier. What was Sandy's? 1 foot. 1 foot below what was covered. Hey, I'm happy. If that's all that, my house is on the northeast corner of Absecon Island. I take the full brunt of a northeaster. The house is built solid. I watched when it was being built. It had hurricane straps where the joists are connected to the beams, so one can't go with the other one. I'm very happy with my house. Hurricane Sandy survived. I got a lot of water, but it never reached my living quarters because I'm 10 feet above mean low water. Isn't that a wonderful thing to think of? So Sandy was directly affected me because it came right over my house. Now, the last one I want to talk about was not a hurricane. But it impacted me more than any other storm I have ever experienced, and that was the March storm of '62. This bad boy was the worst, if only because it came in March. The water's cold. In a hurricane, you can wade your way through the water because they're normally September. Ocean temperature out there right now is 75 degrees. But in March, you've had a winter that has cooled that ocean temperature into the 40s and maybe the upper 30s. March storm of '62 on Ash Wednesday, 5 consecutive high tides. I was marooned. I was working at a radio station in Atlantic City. It was 1960. I was still in college, and I was 62, I'm sorry. I was waiting to be deployed. I had already been accepted at Navy Flight School, and I was ready to go to Marine Corps boot camp. So I was waiting it out, and the station went off the air. The station was located on Atlantic Avenue in Atlantic City, and the doghouse, or the transmitter house, was out on Absecon Boulevard, and we thought it'd be a good idea to try to find out why we're off the air. So we drove out to Absecon Boulevard. At that point, the only street that was above floodwater was Illinois Avenue, which is now Martin Luther King Boulevard. By the time we got, and it was snowing, by the way, which really reduced the visibility a lot more than it does during a tropical storm. Bad news. Little did we know that the 400-foot tower had blown down. Maybe that's a good reason why we were off the air. But on the way back, Illinois Avenue was completely flooded to the point where the news cruiser started to float. Now, when water's coming in, I'm saying, you know, guys, this water's very cold. We might be able to last 15 minutes in this before we start to get, you know, a cold or worse. So we ran into a guy's house on North Illinois Avenue, and we stayed there. And don't forget, we didn't have cell phones. I had no idea what was going on. The news director and another guy, one was from Minnesota, and what's going on here? Tom, you live around here. You keep saying the tide's going out, and it keeps coming in. 2, 3. So he panicked and wanted to go out somewhere. I said, Bobby Connell, I said, you won't last 20 minutes in this water. So finally, we're up on the guy's second floor because his first floor is completely inundated, and I went up on the roof because I can't see anything out. And I see a National Guard amphibious vehicle coming southbound on Illinois Avenue. I've got the guy's bed sheets, and I'm waving them down, because this is our only hope. We're stuck here. Nobody knows where we are, and we could be here forever because the tide never went out. And I finally got his attention, and the National Guardsman said, we can't go any closer to the gentleman's house, because if we do, you know, we're going back and forth like this because the wind is surging the water back and forward. He said, if we hit the house will collapse. So he threw me a line, and I tied it around the chimney of the house, and I said to the other 4 people who were with me, have you ever done a hand walk? Because we're going to learn if you haven't. This is the only way we're going to get off this roof and on to the amphib. So we did hand walks onto the amphib, made it out of there, because don't forget, we're cold. Our clothes are wet because we waded through water to get to this guy's house. And some of us were starting to get, you know, in bad shape because it doesn't take long before your body starts to shut down. I can't think of being impacted any more by a storm than I was in that particular instance of the March of '62 storm. So it doesn't have to be a tropical storm. 40 people were killed. It was compared to the March of '93 storm, which back then they called a superstorm. But it was a big blocking pattern. The storm couldn't go anywhere. And as a result, 5 consecutive high tides. So, you know, it certainly prepared me for a Marine Corps boot camp. And you know, was fortunate enough to be in the Navy and get out of the Navy and intact as a fighter pilot, and I was a carrier pilot. Our runways are shorter than most because they're on the water. And, you know, it was not a popular time to be a military person because Vietnam was not a very popular war. No wars are popular. But the unfortunate thing there was that people not only didn't like the war, they didn't like the warrior. And it was a shame because when we came home, we were told not to wear our uniform. And I think, you know, a lot of the things I experienced in trying to save the other 4 people that were with me during that storm where the tide never went out prepared me for what I was to be trained for in the military. You can't, Jim will tell you that you cannot replicate Marine Corps boot camp, but the Navy thought that if we're going to send this guy up in a multi-million-dollar aircraft, we're going to make sure he can handle it. So we're going to make sure the Marines get him ready for us. Again, that was the only time that I knew that I wanted to be a weather person, when Channel 3 asked me to be a weather person. And I've never looked back. I'm very fortunate. I made it a very good career until I retired 5 years ago. And right now, I just hang out with these guys, you know. And also, more importantly, I'm at the beck and call of any emergency management personnel. If they want my information and there's any way I can help you guys out, I'm your man. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. We have about 25 minutes left in the program. So we have Jim, we have a video presentation, and then we will do your questions. So Jim, take it away. You can.
Thank
I
you
know
very
you're good
much.
at speaking.
I will talk very fast. And listening to Steve, Mike, Justin, Joe, and Nick too, you guys are in good hands over the next 30, 40 years because they have a world of knowledge. And
Especially since you got rid of us.
yeah. So sitting here, I still learn something every day. But for many years, when I first started out, we didn't have all the computer stuff. So when we had a bad forecast, people would always call up and tell us where to go, in a certain sense. But now I'm going to tell you where to go, or how to get there. How's that? But I too want to echo what Tom said about emergency management. Besides knowing us here on the panel, make sure you know your emergency management coordinator. When things happen, they are the people that you are going to rely on, 100%. EMTs, fire, police, 100%. They are the backbone of every disaster that you see. So now what I'll do is, you going to show the video, or am I talking now? Oh, I'm talking. Oh, I know I'm talking. Anyway, if you notice that also at this table on that side, you don't see any white hair yet, and you don't see any notes. So their recall is still pretty good, whereas we were using notes. So that's another sign that we're getting up there a little bit. But anyway, there are 2 things in New Jersey, and Joe almost alluded to it. And in fact, if you get the Atlantic City Press, read Joe's story, because I do. And again, I learned something new by looking at Joe's story and prayer. He does a great job. So if you get the Atlantic City Press, look in there and read up, and you'll find out exactly what's happening. 2 things we evacuate for in New Jersey. We all know hurricanes. And we had Gloria, voluntary evacuation, September 1985. And what they're showing you on the screen here, the evacuation routes from the different counties of South Jersey. Cape May is like Florida is to the U.S. We're a peninsula, so it's very difficult for Cape May residents to get out if you don't get out in time, if you don't listen to emergency management. As Joe alluded to, 45 hours to evacuate Cape May, and that is a real test. Again, you have to listen to emergency management when they ask you to leave. And I'm rambling on here a little bit because I'm jumping from one thing to another, but Gloria we evacuated for, that was voluntary in 1985. That's the one Tom flew into. Irene was a mandatory evacuation, and that was August 2011. Everything east of Route 9, we evacuated. I evacuated too. Sandy, the Barrier Islands, evacuated in October 2012. And Steve mentioned that New York City, they had a tough time deciding whether they were going to evacuate, and it's a good thing they did. 375,000 people evacuated Zone A. First time ever New York City ever evacuated in any storm. And I was telling Nick not too long ago, if New York City was to get a Category 3, moving similar to what Sandy did, picture 21 feet of water on JFK Airport, 21 feet of water. Now, where are you going to evacuate 24 million people to? You're not going to do it. So if you don't get out and listen to emergency management, or if they don't have the plans that we have here in New Jersey for evacuating, you could have a huge death toll in the hundreds of thousands. It may seem crazy, But if you look at the setup, the reason Sandy was so powerful and did so much damage, wherever the coastline makes a 90-degree angle, that's where your surge is the highest. And Sandy had nowhere to go but come in. The water was coming in for 36 hours. You get the surge, you get two surges. You get the surge from the storm, and then you get what they call a mechanical surge. That's the secondary surge, and that's what you saw up the East River. Again, what I'm talking about, you're not seeing on the screen here, but the idea is in evacuating New Jersey, there was a study done 2 years ago, and Justin, you went to Rutgers? This study came out of Rutgers 2 years ago by 3 professors, one from Turkey, one from China, and one from New York. And they found out that the other thing that we evacuate for here is high pressure. We evacuate every Sunday. And because we do, believe it or not, when we do have a hurricane threatening us, like Irene and Sandy, these people have been doing this for years. And they found out in this study that the problems that people experience in a weekend evacuation compared to what happened in Irene and Sandy are no different. You have the same choke points, and I think, were you there for the Escape the Cape in 2011, I believe, down in Cape May? Everybody, we talk about reverse lane strategy. What that means is turning all the roads going west and getting them out of here. In the case of Cape May here, you got to go up and go in, just like you do in Florida. But now, through this study, we're finding out that if people listen to the emergency management community, as the storm is coming up and you're getting the latest information from these fellows here, you can peacefully evacuate the Jersey Shore, and you know that. And again, we do it every, and people say, we evacuate in high pressure? Yes, we do. We evacuate. So that's that study. If you guys want a copy of it, I'll send it to you. It's really a great study. The other thing I want to talk about is sometimes evacuation is not recommended. And I think Steve or Justin mentioned Harvey down in Texas. Well, that was a disaster when they tried to evacuate in Rita after what happened with Katrina. People wanted to get out early. They had 400,000 people who didn't leave New Orleans. About 350,000 people did. So now Hurricane Rita came along, and people evacuated to the tune of 3.2 million. Turns out there were more people killed in the evacuation than what the storm caused. There were choke points outside of Houston that you couldn't even get through. Emergency vehicles were stalled dead because the traffic jam was so big. You had a bus caught on fire, people died in the fire. So you have to be very careful when you look at these storms and how you're going to evacuate and when the evacuation is called for. And the emergency management community, they're in direct contact with the National Hurricane Center. And they're giving them the latest information on when people should get out and what they should do and how to stay safe. So always listen to them, and always listen to the TV stations that you see here. And again, I'm jumping around here. Mike, you mentioned you work for the AccuWeather of Europe? Yes. I just want to have a shout out because I was in contact with a friend of mine I've known for 35 years, Joe Bastardi, who was with AccuWeather. He's now with WeatherBell, so he said he wished he could have been here tonight with us. So make sure you tell Joe that. So what else do I want to say? Today is the 63rd anniversary of a hurricane hunter that went down in a hurricane in 1955, and it was Hurricane Janet. And this is the book here. It's called Storm Chaser. I read it before, but I was reading it again just recently, and the reason I did is because I flew into Category 5 Mitch when it was in the Honduras, Western Caribbean, was one of the strongest hurricanes on record. And reading this book here, and Tom alluded to too when he flew into Gloria, and reading this book, how scared these people were going into the storm, and I look back and I'm thinking, are you kidding me? That was scary. That was scary. So hurricanes are dangerous things. In fact, one of the guys I was up with in the airplane, he said it's safer up there than it is down here. And the reason is because we have to get people out of harm's way. And so my point being is, with evacuations, I worked with the National Weather Service for 38 years and emergency management for 35. before, if you could go back a couple of slides there, I just wanted to point something out here. There is, I'm pointing to, this is what we call a slosh model. Each time there's a hurricane coming up the coast or in the Gulf of Mexico, the National Hurricane Center will run this model. And this model is also available to the emergency management community under a program called HURAVAC. And what this does, will take the storm, the actual storm, it'll tell you based on its track, its intensity, that color bar that you see at the top of it, that's in feet. That's the surge. That's just the surge from the storm. That's not taking into consideration the actual regular astronomical height, say. So in New York City, if you look where my finger is pointing, that's the area that was hit pretty good with Sandy, because that was, as Joe said, in the northeast quadrant. So all the water had nowhere to go. It came up the coast, it hit the west end of Long Island Sound and went into the East River, and they had a storm tide of 14.8 feet up there. The surge, I believe, was what, 8.9 feet, something like that. So the storm tide together was one of the highest on record. So again, my point being, for people in North Jersey and up there in Staten Island and Western Long Island, in New York City, 24 million people reside in that area. And is a Category 3 going to make landfall up there like Sandy? I don't know. I don't think any of us would tell you that. But it only takes a 3. We don't need a Category 4 or 5 here. It only takes a 3. So the point being, and what I want to end with here is, make sure you listen to these fellas. If you're within eyesight or earsight, or you read the paper, keeping track of these storms throughout the hurricane season, because you can tell they have a world of knowledge, and they'll give you the best information available to you. And also listen to your emergency management community. They work with the city government and the mayor, and they're the ones who will have all the information available to you, where to go, how to stay safe, if there's going to be any shelters and things like that. So I'll just wrap that up, and I thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. We have one more presentation. Like I mentioned, my intern couldn't be here today, but he did an incredible job putting this presentation together, and we wanted to run the video that he put together for this because I didn't want him to miss out. It's all on social media, by the way.
Gift and a curse when it comes to forecasting weather. We now have ways to instantly connect to thousands of people, but unfortunately, there are also headaches created. We now find ourselves in a situation where we have to ask, who can we trust? And now let's go to knowing where to go. The first place, television. The more local, the better. And these local stations have live break-ins and extensive coverage for severe weather events. National news networks like CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News just don't have time to cover the local weather stories that matter, unless there's a crippling tornado outbreak or a Category 4 or 5 hurricane slamming the Gulf Coast. Then sure, they'll devote some time, but it will be on a national scale, not down to the neighborhood like. And these local stations have trained weather forecasters that are paid to bring you the latest and most accurate information. In our markets, we have meteorologists who have spent years in college learning the ins and outs of weather in our area. The second place to go to is radio. Radio is the source that is available anywhere, anytime, if you have a battery-powered radio. And that's why I urge you to buy a battery-powered radio, because you do not know when you'll need it. Radio is the best way to receive the latest information in case of power outages. So let's say there's a severe thunderstorm that knocks out power, or a tornado, hail, flooding, whatnot. A battery-powered radio will always be there for you. Know which radio stations have weather segments and know which don't. In this Philadelphia, South Jersey area, the #1 news radio station in the area is KYW News Radio 1060, which reaches just about everyone on 1060 AM and through most of South Jersey except Cape May and the Jersey Shore on 94.1 WIP HD2. HD radio is like crystal clear radio because AM has, you know, the static and everything. And when it comes to thunderstorms, it might be very spotty. Also, EAS alerts are transmitted all over radio stations in case of a warning. Now, what is EAS? EAS is the Emergency Alert System, and that overrules any program that occurs on any radio station. So let's say there's a severe thunderstorm going on right here in Stone Harbor. The radio stations that occupy the Cape May County area will go straight into an emergency alert service message saying that there's a severe thunderstorm warning and that these cities will be affected at these times. Here's an example from New Jersey 101.5, a radio station that serves mainly Central Jersey. Here's an example of a real emergency alert system message.
The National Weather Service in Mount Holly, New Jersey has issued a severe thunderstorm warning for central Mercer County in central New Jersey, southeastern Bucks County in southeastern Pennsylvania until 2:30 p.m. At 2:06 p.m., Doppler radar indicated a severe thunderstorm capable of producing damaging winds in excess of 60 miles per hour.
Aside from television and radio, the place where everyone seemingly goes to get the weather information today is the internet. And I have to admit, the best thing to happen in this so-called digital era is the easier access to anywhere in the World Wide Web. Now, only some people know how to receive the latest information on the internet. I know my little brother is one of those people. You know, because again, he grew up learning the internet. Everything he does is on the internet. But what about those who are not that familiar with the internet? Multiple screens from which to access. You have your phone. What I'm recording this on, my laptop. You have smart TVs even. So there are many also forms of the internet where you can actually grab weather information. But you should, in the internet, know where to go and who to trust. And I'll get to that in 1 second. The number one example of people messing up the internet aspect of getting information is this common saying, but my weather app said, so what your weather app said? Because the weather app that you have, whether it's AccuWeather, the Weather Channel, all of these weather apps are automated and they have zero human input. Because look, this is a real AccuWeather 45-day forecast. Here's a picture for Stone Harbor from AccuWeather.com. Do you expect there to be middle 70s and sunshine in the middle of October? Do you think a forecast is even possible? Okay, sure, that's very ludicrous. But what about the 7 or 15-day forecast you see on the Weather Channel app? Both this and the AccuWeather channel, the app, whatever, that comes from something in the weather community we call the GOOFUS model, or the GFS, the American model. Again, this is all automated. This comes straight from a model output. No human input. Another example that you should be aware of, recycled stories or graphics. Here's an example from this March. Someone posted on Nick's timeline asking if this is, believable at all. And it showed a major snowstorm for South Central Jersey, a crippling snowstorm for North Jersey, New York City, Connecticut. That picture was from last March in 2017, not 18. And this was retweeted many times by many people, and that fooled a lot of people. Again, you have to beware and look on the timestamp on when these things are just written. Another example of seeing, problems on the internet. Beware of stealers. Here's an example from a weather page, again, this winter. That's my graphics right there. No credit given at all, and it's a slightly hyped up forecast as well. And he has a pretty decent following, yet he steals graphics. If you cannot forecast yourself or provide a forecast that people understand yourself, you should not be trusted. Another example of people to beware of wish casting. So let's imagine you are the one who loves hurricanes. So you're going to predict the next hurricane, let's say Debbie. Debbie is going to ride up the East Coast because this model said it would. But what about the other hundreds of models? What if they don't say it? So here's an example from our very own Mike Masco. Where's my 20 inches of snow? The snow is now rain in 2 consecutive model runs. Wish casting is a dangerous thing. Hashtag the more you know. That just shows you, if people just post a model map without any explanation, they should not be trusted, because that is likely a form of wish casting. I always tend to write a lot, and I know Nick writes a lot of stuff. And some people just don't care to read it. And then in the comments section, Nick always has to refer you back to that section so you read and understand. Another thing, which is probably the highlight, the one real thing that you need to know to be wary of: hype. Take a look here, 350.org. Hurricanes have become 700% more powerful in 30 years. So powerful that scientists want to create a new Category 6 to define hurricanes with. Seriously? Seriously? The Saffir-Simpson scale was created a long time ago, and that scale still applies to hurricanes today. It shouldn't be tweaked in any sort of way. Whatever winds it carries is whatever winds it carries with. And having this sort of hype, this diction that is just super alertful, that is unnecessary, is just not needed. So if you see somewhere saying, Chris will make North Carolina beaches evaporate, first off, beaches can't evaporate. And that's impossible for a hurricane that was 200 miles offshore. I saw many retweets on Twitter of people saying that Chris is going to ruin the Outer Banks. Chris passed. I'm in Myrtle Beach right now. No sign that Chris did anything significant. Also, speaking of hype, there's a very subtle form of hype when it comes to the headline and the picture attached. Because again, how many times do people just go swipe, 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 right? Look, some people will get hooked on this. Here's an example from ABC's Good Morning America and World News Tonight. Beryl strengthens, expected to hit the Caribbean as a hurricane. Puerto Rico braces for heavy wind, rain as Beryl approaches. Okay, the diction a little bit serious, I understand. Bracing, yes, yes. But look at the picture. That looks like a monster Category 5 to an everyday person. Now look at what Beryl was. It should be above me, I think, right? That was Beryl at the time these articles were published. That looks nothing like it. And Beryl was already downgraded to a tropical storm at that time, so it's not even a hurricane anymore. So that just shows you these subtle forms of hype. You know, they get into our minds and they manipulate what we think. So, you know, no matter what, if you're on the left, if you're on the right, just seeing some things handled out of proportion ruins the look that we professional meteorologists have. Anyways, I hope you guys learned a very valuable lesson when it comes to knowing where to go and knowing who to trust. And again, once again, thank you so much, Nick, for giving me this opportunity. It's a pleasure.